Welcome to Heart Challenges Hate, a discussion series. Tonight, let's talk about race. Join us now live from the campus of Sacred Heart University with your host, Dr. Michelle Loris.
Good evening, and welcome to our colloquium tonight, Heart Challenges Hate, Let's Talk About Race. My name is Michelle Loris, and I'll be the moderator for our colloquium this evening. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, the College of Arts and Science, the Department of Catholic Studies, and the Center for Catholic Studies, and Shoe Community Theater. The purpose of the Heart Challenges Hate series is to respond with knowledge and informed and reasoned discussion and faith and values to the prevalence of hatred, bigotry, and violence that we see in America today. It's our assumption that as a Catholic university, it's our responsibility to respond to this violence and bigotry. Tonight, our aim is to have a basic and real conversation about race. And we know that such conversations are fraught with challenges and tensions. The history of such challenges go back some 400 years in America's history to slavery, to Jim Crow, segregation, the civil rights, and even to the civil unrest that we experience in America today. But our aim, despite the challenging topics that we're going to be talking about tonight, the aim of our conversation is to bring understanding. And with understanding, we hope to establish connection and community between and among all of us. So, to engage in our conversation tonight, it's my honor, and I'm delighted to introduce tonight's panelists. First, I want to welcome Daniel D. Thomas, a 2008 graduate of Sacred Heart University, now a university trustee and chairman of D. Thomas Homes. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks
Glad
for
that
having
you're
me.
here with us. Julie Lawrence. Julie is Chief Diversity Officer for Diversity and Inclusion at Sacred Heart University, and she's been with us a couple of times on these panels. Welcome again, Julie. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Michelle.
And Gary McNamara, our Executive Director of Public Safety and Government Affairs at Sacred Heart University. Gary's has 30 years of experience in law enforcement. Joining us online, I'm really happy to introduce Aisha Lubin Loesch, a 2007 graduate of Sacred Heart University and now Senior Vice President of Equity, Diversion, and Inclusion at Hill Holliday. Welcome, Aisha. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Bill Usman, Associate Professor of Communications and Media. Dr. Usman's area of expertise in his scholarship and teaching is the topic of race and media. Welcome, Bill. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
So, thank you all for being here. Thank you for engaging in this conversation. And without further ado, let's get started. So, Daniel, I'm going to start with you. All right?
Let's do it.
Why is it so difficult to talk about race? Sometimes we bring that topic up in the classroom or with our friends, and people resist it. They kind of want to shut it down. What's so difficult?
You know, in my opinion, I believe it's difficult because we're not taught the entire story of race in our country. And because we're not taught the entire story, we're led to believe that if you work hard and you do everything right, then your fortune or misfortune is only tied to you. It's not tied to anything else. So we're taught that in our country, slavery happened, slaves were freed, Dr. Martin Luther King made a speech. After he made a speech, everybody lived happily ever after, and that was it. We don't talk about those 100 years of Jim Crow after slavery, and we don't talk about how that's affected our community, the Black community, from those 100 years till now. So when we look at the 244 years that we have as a country in America, in those 244 years, if you're white, you've had the ability to build wealth, to get a mortgage and not be discriminated against. You've had the ability to send your kids to any school system that you wanted to, and you had a head start. And if you're Black, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. So that means that there's only been 56 years for someone of color to actually have the right to not be discriminated against. And when you think about that, my mom is over 56 years old, and I guarantee everybody on this panel, their parents are over 56 years old. That means that if you're Black, your parents were most likely born in a world or in a country where they didn't have the rights to not be discriminated against. So if you're a millennial, you're actually the first generation in your family that was born into an America where legally you couldn't be discriminated against. So that means you've only had 56 years where your counterparts had 244 years. And I think when you tell someone that your white counterpart, when they kind of see that for them, they've had a head start or race may have played a role in them building wealth, and the Black counterpart, you had only 56 years to try to build wealth. It's hard to talk about because no one wants to be told that their hard work, that their families passed down to them, has anything to do with race. So I think because of that, it's difficult to have these conversations. And when we talk about those 100 years of Jim Crow, again, if you were Black and you try to move into a certain community, there are communities called sundown communities where if you try to move in there, you could have a cross burnt on your front lawn. If you try to get a mortgage, you would be denied it. There are certain communities where you couldn't get a mortgage in. If you try to send your kids to school to get a better education from a certain school district, again, as we've seen with Ruby, as she walked into that school building, we've had people saying, "No, I don't want my kids going to school with Black people." So it's difficult because of us not being taught through that other 100 years of Jim Crow leading up to today.
So we haven't really been talking about race, or it's been difficult to. Aisha, I'd like to turn to you a minute. What would you add to what Daniel's just been helping us understand?
Yes, and thank you, Daniel, for adding, the history and the context. Simply we're not allowed to talk about it. It's been a taboo conversation and topic for many years. You don't talk about money, you don't talk about race, you don't talk about religion, right? So when we have simple conversations, we focus on the weather, we focus on niceties. We are now moving away from saying that we're colorblind. But, race has been something that has been taught to us that you just kind of ignore, you just kind of focus on the person and their content of their character. And as folks tend to idolize those words from Dr. Martin Luther King, we all know that in his time, he was considered a radical person. So how we have kind of looked at the pacified version of him and really tried to idolize that, I think it's really, people don't realize the hurt and the vitriol and the hate that he received for saying those very simple words. So again, race has always been a taboo. I think it continues to be a little bit of a taboo, but in this day and age, we're able to and in this moment, we're opening up about the conversation. So I'm glad that we're here tonight to talk about it.
So, one of the first things that we really want to understand is that it's been a taboo topic, and we haven't really had the permission to talk about race. So, I want us to sort of, I'm going to keep track of these really important points that you all are making. I know we'll be having more of these colloquia, and it's important for our audience to also kind of keep these points in mind. Well, the other thing I want to talk about is, how do we define racism and racist acts? I mean, that's something that, we often hear people saying, well, that's not racist. Just everybody wants to just say everything's racist. Julie, what about you? How do we define racism?
Yes, Michelle, thank you for asking that question. And it's interesting right now in the current environment in which we are living, a young woman named Kennedy Mitchum reached out to Merriam-Webster to say that every time I try to talk to my friends about race and racism, they say, well, I'm not racist. You can just look right here in the dictionary and it'll show you. Well, actually, Merriam-Webster took it upon themselves to change the definition this June in the midst of everything we've been going through with the racial unrest currently. So racism is identified or defined as three things. Firstly, it is a social construct. Secondly, it is political and social in nature. And thirdly, it is institutional and structural. So if we start with the piece about it being a social construct, race is something that was designed by white people so that poorer white people would feel comfortable working yet looking at someone else that was less than them. So this scheme that was set up to make Black and brown people less than has morphed into Black and brown people are not as smart, not as accomplished, lazy, whatever, all in an effect to make one race higher or more in power than another race. So that's some of the social construct of it. There's one race, the human race, and then we have various ethnicities, colors, and things of that nature. So let's just break that fantasy right now. There's one race, the human race. The second piece is the institutionalized aspect of it. And the institutionalized aspect, which Aisha and Daniel both touched on, is that race and racism have been in the society, since we came to America and in other countries before. Laws, voting rights, housing, proximity to whiteness. So we talk about color and colorism. All of it is wrapped up in this anti-Blackness that racism really promotes, and promotes in order to make people feel that they have someone beneath them. So finally, the third thing is the political aspect that we talk about. Race and racism are not political. They're institutional. It's a social construct. And when we talk about people's rights, they're human rights, so it can't be political. It's racism is something that we really have to begin to look at and talk about, the taboo nature of it. I'll just say, most parents of color have to talk to their children or deal with the fact that their child's going to come home at some point in time and say that, so-and-so called me the N-word, so-and-so called me an S-word, K-word, whatever. So as a Black woman, I remember I was in second grade, I was 7, and some kid at Madison School over on Wayne Street here in Fairfield, Bridgeport, called me the N-word, and I had to come home crying and tell my parents that, and my father went to the school. So needless to say, nobody has ever since called me that word. However, it's something that as a Black woman, as most Black families, have to, have the crushing heartbreak of their child coming home to tell them that. So that to me is what racism is, that a young child could call another child that it's so systemic. And that's really what we have to try to work on breaking.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for that. And so it's really important to understand how embedded it has become in the structure of our society and in the psyche, in the American psyche.
Yes.
And that it really began as a rationalization to justify, if you want, slavery and then Jim Crow and segregation.
Correct.
So that rationalization has then become systemic. Bill Usman, I know that this is your bailiwick. So how would you add to what Julie's talking about? What constitutes racism?
Well, I think what I could add to begin with is distinguishing between racism and prejudice, and the understanding that while prejudice are individual attitudes, feelings of animosity towards someone from a group identity other than yours, it's a problem, but it's not the same as racism. Racism is much larger because racism represents when a society is actually structured to benefit one group at the disadvantage of other groups based on perceptions of racial identity. And, you and Julie both correctly pointed out how this was a construct that was created really to justify slavery. Slavery is kind of the perfect example just to start with, but not to end with. It would be absurd to think that slavery wasn't all about race. And the very concept of race and the idea that there is some type of biological differences that makes one group superior to another was really created to justify the economic exploitation of other human beings. But we can't stop there. Daniel also pointed out, right? Racism doesn't just vanish when the Emancipation Proclamation was made. that wasn't the end of it. It continues to this day in multiple other disguises. And so we have to see it as a system of power and inequality, one where you can be complicit in perpetuating racism, even if you individually don't see yourself as a prejudiced person. You can still benefit from a system of white supremacy. So, for example, I could say that if I work in a department that is dominated by white people and is primarily white people, and I do nothing to work to change that, if I do nothing to work for the hiring and the support and the promotion of diverse people, of people of color, then I'm actually perpetuating this system of racial exploitation and white supremacy. People get very nervous about this term white supremacy because they associate it with groups like the Ku Klux Klan. But you don't have to be that type of racial extremist when you understand that white supremacy is crucial to this notion of systemic racism. When all of the major political, social, educational, legal, economic systems in a nation are dominated by white people to the disadvantage of people of color, this is really a system of white supremacy.
Yeah.
And just to finish, that's not just a claim, that's supported by statistics, statistical
Right.
analysis.
And I hope that you'll be able to share with us some of that data, because one of the topics we do want to take up and focus on is white supremacy and systemic racism. But thank you, Bill, because that is what is perpetuating this whole idea of racism. But I want to turn to Gary a minute. Gary, so your 30 years of working with law enforcement, how do you see racism? How did you see it acted out, defined? How would you talk about it?
Yeah, well, I think that, it's interesting to have these discussions because you learn as well as share. And uh, I think that the way it was originally presented to a lot of people was racism is this somehow larger thing that just exists, that racism is there. And now what we're finding is that it's individualized. And it's a very complex topic to really understand, and no one wants to necessarily be defined as or being called a racist. So I think that how I would look at it from law enforcement perspective is how we treat people, and are we treating them differently just based upon their race? And obviously there's laws against that, but how do we treat people, and are we recognizing the fact that the way in which we contact them as a police officer might be different than the experiences they had in the past? And um, so I think it's really looking at someone differently and treating them differently based upon their race and your perception of what that race means to you, or you were taught, or you were told. So I look at some of the stuff that was discussed, like Daniel just said, about really a lack of understanding. And the more you kind of learn and the more you really understand what it is that people of color or black people have dealt with, you start to really get a better understanding maybe of all the things you don't realize and that you don't know. And if you don't know, how do you fix that problem? But I think overall, from a law enforcement perspective, we are always taught to treat people equally. And it's when you don't treat people equally that you certainly further that racism model in law enforcement.
So I think actually, thank you, Gary. Thank you for that, because that leads right into this next topic, which is Black Lives Matter. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement is a huge movement intended to help us understand, to help us to see. And yet, some of the things that we hear are that uh, oh, this whole movement, the Black Lives Movement, is so unnecessary. After all, don't all lives matter? Um, Aisha, how would you respond to that complaint?
Yeah, it's something that we've heard day in and day out throughout this movement, and all lives matter. all lives cannot matter until Black Lives Matter. And so what that means is Black Lives Matter too. And what we've seen year over year since this movement started, about 7 years ago, and as Daniel had illustrated prior, the past 401 years, right? Black lives have not been a focal point or um, a a element of the American culture that we've been able to really get behind, where folks have been here. My parents are. Today's my dad's birthday. He's 70 today. For laws that allow him to be free, in the past 15 years is remarkable, right? For him to be able to vote, for him to be able to think and fight about things that when they bought their house in 1980, people petitioned because they didn't want a Black family in their neighborhood. And my parents are still in the same neighborhood, many years later. But what that means is Black Lives Matter. Two, all lives absolutely matter. But when we're looking at, the disparities, we're looking at the chasm in which people are treated in this country, we have to focus on Black lives. We have to fix the wrongs that have been happening, and we have to change it, as we talked about earlier, systemically. You don't hear people going to, breast cancer walks and talking about colon cancer, and you don't hear, people talking about all these different things and comparing, contrasting, because that wouldn't make sense. So doing it here also doesn't make sense. People of color have been marginalized and put into a second class status. And so by this movement that was founded by three amazing women, they were just trying to articulate Black Lives Matter too. And they wanted to get people to rally behind them to show that fact and help create change within our society and culture.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you for that. And Daniel, I want to ask you, what would you add to what Aisha's telling us?
I guess the best way to explain it, and Aisha did a fabulous job. My 8-year-old, when this whole Black Lives Matter movement started, she looked at me and she said, Daddy, don't all lives matter? Why are people getting angry when someone says all lives matter? Shouldn't everyone's life matter? It doesn't make sense to me. And, and she's right, all life should matter. And I had to explain to her what Aisha said, that, through history, all lives can't matter, Black lives don't matter. And through history, Black lives haven't always mattered. And just to give you a couple of statistics, and starting from 1972, Black lives have been experimented with. They've been treated as second-class citizens. In 1972 was the end of the Tuskegee experiment, where Black people were actually injected with syphilis, just to see if they weren't treated, what would happen to them. 1985 in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Police Department dropped bombs on a Black community, and the police chief admitted that he wanted to watch it burn. 1987, the CIA actually introduced crack cocaine into Black communities. 1994, there's a crime bill that called Black people super predators, and there was a 3-strike law. You're going to jail for life. 2011, there were 2 judges in Philadelphia that were convicted for selling Black children into the criminal justice system for profit, just so they can fill the beds. 2014, we had Flint, Michigan, where 60% of the residents are minorities and their drinking water was tainted. That's going to be a whole generational problem of people dealing with lead paint. So when we say Black Lives Matter, it's the second part to it is that we've seen over the last few years Black people who are dying for doing things that are normal. And while they're doing them, the people who are killing them aren't being convicted. So if we start with Trayvon Martin walking home with Skittles, not only was he killed, the person who murdered him wasn't even arrested on that same day. If we go back, there was a case where a mother was parked in a handicapped parking spot, and a white person approached her and said, "You can't park here." Her husband comes out and says, "What are you doing?" The person shoots the husband. He wasn't arrested that same day. We have people eating ice cream in their home, and someone comes in and shoots them, not arrested the same day. Tamir Rice playing with a toy gun in a park, shot within 2 seconds. The police officer wasn't arrested the same day. Selling cigarettes, sleeping in your home like Breonna Taylor. We had a neighbor who called the cops because his neighbor's door was open, saying, "Hey, can you do a wellness check?" Cop shows up and kills her. Wasn't arrested the same day. George Floyd, 8 minutes on his neck. And these are just small cases that we've seen throughout history that tells us that, listen, Black lives have not always mattered. And not only didn't they matter to some people, their murderers weren't even brought to justice until we had the Black Lives Matter movement, which started publishing these videos, demanding and having an outcry and demanding justice.
Daniel, thank you. That's overwhelming. I mean, really, what you presented is an avalanche of facts would show how long Black lives have not mattered. Yes.
And if I can add, it's a very, very small, this is 0.00001% of the cases. And these are just the cases that made highlights. There are thousands and thousands of thousands of these cases. So when people think like, oh, you're playing the race card, or, it's not that bad out there, it is, because a lot of things aren't caught on camera. And a lot of police reports, again, even we saw George Floyd die, right? In 8 minutes. And the police report said the knee isn't what killed him. So again, this is a very, very small percentage of what's actually happening in the world.
And it's overwhelming. It's a small percentage, but it's overwhelming. Dr. Usman, I'd like to ask you, I've heard you talk about this at other times. Why should we consider the importance of Black Lives Matter? Bill, hold on a minute. I think we had a little technological glitch.
I was just saying that Daniel and Aisha laid it out so well. From 1619 until 2020, America has acted like Black lives don't matter. Black Lives Matter is simply a call for a correction to that. No one would argue that all lives don't matter, but it's Black lives that have been under siege in America. It's if my house is on fire and the firefighters come to my house and the neighbor comes out and complains, why aren't you spraying down my house? Well, your house isn't on fire right now. We need to address the real issues that we're talking about. All of the tragic examples that they offered, these are real. And as Daniel pointed out, this isn't even the tip of the iceberg. This is an ice cube compared to what America has done to Black people right from the very beginning. And the other thing I want to add just very quickly is there has been a lot of disinformation and propaganda about what the Black Lives Matter movement really is and what it really stands for. This is not a violent movement. This is not, they've even been called terrorists. This is not a terrorist movement. This is a non-violent call for civil disobedience, which is historically part of the American experience. Civil disobedience and disruption is not violence. The only violence that has really occurred at Black Lives Matter protests, to be honest with you, has been violence perpetrated by far-right white supremacist groups and by police departments who have responded to peaceful protests with tear gas and billy clubs. So Black Lives Matter is assertive, it's unflinching, and it's bold, and it's a call to address this history that Daniel and Aisha have pointed out, where we've acted like Black lives just simply don't matter.
And indeed they haven't. Thank you so much for that, Bill. And I think I just want to underscore that last part that you talked about, the disinformation, the misinformation about the Black Lives Matter movement, that it's a nonviolent movement based on civil disobedience, which, as you said, does have a long history in America. And I think that that's something we'd like our audience to keep as another one of these points that we want to underscore, because I think there's a lot of misperception about that. So thank you for telling us that, Bill. Now, the hot topic. This is a really challenging topic, the topic of white privilege. And I know, Bill, you started to talk about it before, but white privilege and systemic racism, it makes white people very uncomfortable to even hear those phrases. I know it does. And yet, it's something that we do have to talk about. We cannot not address it. Julie, I'm going to pick on you to start us on that one.
Okay, so Michelle, no picking. That's all right. I can take it. Where racism oppresses and seeks to erase the contributions, historical and otherwise, and lives of Black people, the reality is that privilege affords white people a set of social and economic advantages by virtue just of being white. In a culture characterized, like Aisha, like Bill, like Daniel stated, characterized by racial inequality, Whether asked for or not, that's what white privilege is. It is by lieu of being white, white people are preempted and exempted from all of the things we've just been talking about. So put another way, white people's skin color is not used to oppress or deny rights. And I'm going to read a quote. We're not supposed to read, but I'm going to read a quote from Ibram X. Kendi, who has written the book How to Be Anti-Racist. So he says, to be white is to be afforded one's individuality, afforded the presumption of innocence, afforded the assumption of intelligence, afforded empathy when raging and crying, afforded disproportionate amounts of policymaking power, afforded opportunity from a white network, afforded wealth-building homes and resource-rich schools, afforded the ability to vote quickly and easily. Privilege is a comparative advantages racism affords to people identified as white, whether white people recognize or deny these privileges. So I thought that that was really captured just the day-to-day differences that being Black in America or being a person of color in America faces as opposed to white people. And that really was, to me, the essence of what privilege looks like.
Thank you, Julie. That's really poignant. Thank you. Aisha, I'm going to ask you, what would you add to help us understand this topic of white privilege and to help us be able to talk about it with others?
Right. So, having white privilege doesn't mean your life wasn't hard. It just means being white hasn't made it harder. So, I have privilege from where I've gone to school. I was able to go to Sacred Heart University and get a degree and get advanced degrees and certifications. And there's different types of privilege, but my skin will always be the forefront of what people see about that. They won't see the certifications. They won't see the degrees. They will always see me for being a Black woman in a space where they may feel uncomfortable. So when we're talking about Black or white privilege with others, you just really have to be open to hearing and listening and acknowledging. We're so quick in these days to have, discussions and to have combative quibs and whataboutism, which is not real. And so when we really can get down to understanding what is being meant by the privilege in which your skin is given you, as Julie has so articulately quoted and has stated, it just makes things less, I don't want to say less difficult, but it just makes them, you don't have that hurdle to jump. So when you walk into a bank being a white person, you don't have the same hurdle to jump as I do and have as much proof. For example, the other day I was at the pharmacy and my prescription rang up for $50 and the woman, without asking me how I was going to pay for it, asked if I could afford it. So, why someone would ask me that for any other reason beyond my skin tone is something that I have to think about, those daily microaggressions. And these are things that you may not have, Dr. Lawrence experienced because of, your skin is not something that people inherently have this preconceived notion about what you do, what you can afford, and what you can't afford. So as you talk to your friends and family about privilege, and when they think about, it's really just simply being white hasn't made your life harder. You've had a hard life. We understand that you've had, challenges, and no one is taking those things away from you. It's really to understand and to listen to how others have been affected by their color in their workplace, in their lives. Just navigating day to day is extremely important. So as you talk to folks, it's really about listening to people of color to help you understand, what your privilege has really showed itself to be in your day-to-day in your lives.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you for that. Bill Usman, you started to talk about white privilege and systemic racism a little bit earlier, and I'd like to ask you to talk to us a little bit more about that. How do they go together, this white privilege and systemic racism? What are some of the examples of it? You said that there was some research to back it up. Are you here, Bill? There you go. Hold on, Bill. Wait. We're having a technological glitch with. Okay, go ahead.
Even in my own life, like I know that I benefit from white privilege and frankly gender privilege every single day. I can go into a store or drive down the street without being followed with suspicion. When I walk into a classroom, with a group of students, I'm almost automatically taken seriously as an expert in my field, as an authority figure. If someone treats me poorly or rudely, I don't have to worry about, well, is this because of my race or my gender? I can apply for a loan and get a better interest rate, which happens. I can look for a house without being redirected out of certain neighborhoods. I can apply for a job and not have to deal with racial or gender discrimination. If I'm pulled over for a broken taillight, I don't have to worry about whether I'm going to get put in jail or beaten or literally shot in the back. I mean, I could just go on, but I want to add just quickly that we have to think of these things intersectionally so that, we have to take into account race, class, gender, sexuality, ability. So for example, a white man who might work a minimum wage job, he certainly doesn't have wealth privilege, but he still has privilege based on his race and his gender. You take President Barack Obama, for example, right? When he was president of the United States, he was the most powerful person in the world. And yet that didn't stop people from attacking him on a daily basis for his race and for making all types of terrible stereotypical comments and cartoons and slurs that they never would have done for a white president, frankly. And so I think we do have to recognize that all of this plays out in our lives on a daily basis and on multiple levels all at the same time.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. So Aisha and Bill and Julie, you've given us so much to think about how really the privilege that's accorded to white people on the smallest level and the largest level is embedded into every structure of our society: educational, economic, health system, government system. And so this is important for us to keep in mind. Um, so, with some of the time left, this is perhaps, Gary, one of the most difficult topics that we address in America today. And it's the topic of police brutality and the mass incarceration, especially of Black men. And it's certainly one of the most contentious things. Gary, from your perspective in law enforcement, can you what would you say about this topic?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is. While all are interconnected, I do think that this is probably one of the most glaring problems that exists today, because it reinforces all of the concerns and all of the thoughts that Black families have when their kids go and drive or they go out into the communities, and it's horrible. And I remember I was 22 years old when I became a police officer, and I still have and remember the first time I realized I wanted to be a police officer. It was a book I read when I was really young, and it was What Police and Firemen Do All Day. And nowhere in there does it say brutalize people or treat people different because of their race. And I think that uh, what we've seen, and especially with the George Floyd incident, now, we all remember, and Daniel did a great job of discussing some of the other incidents that occurred, but I'll go back as far as Rodney King. I was a young police officer and couldn't believe the acts that were committed on Rodney King on the highway in Los Angeles by several officers brutalizing Mr. King on a motor vehicle stop. So it is a huge problem, and one that really, until we really get a grasp of that, I don't think that there's going to be a sense of moving forward as a society. I think that brings great concern, and I think it starts with, first of all, police leadership and community leadership. What are we doing? Who are we hiring to be police officers, and what do we want of our police officers to do? And I think that we need to make sure that people are getting into the field of law enforcement for the right reasons. and because they're given such awesome power, we have such police officers have such power given to us that we can take away people's rights, and in that we're given the ability to use the amount of force necessary to affect the taking of someone's rights. And having that power, you have to make sure you have the right people that are going to accept that responsibility, and then you have to train them the right way, and you have to make them part of the discussion. One of the concerns that I have these days is that I don't I don't know of a police officer in the country that saw the incident with George Floyd and didn't get angry and mad and disgusted. And that's only one incident, and there's other incidents. But police have to be part of the discussion to make it better. And that's, I think, the only way that we can all move forward. We have to understand the impact we're having on the Black community in order to kind of have these discussions to move forward.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for that. And we do. I mean, that's part of the reason for even the colloquia series. I want to get to Bill, but Daniel, I see that you wanted to say something. And
Yeah.
so before I go to Bill Usman, what would you like to?
I just want to add for a minute just some stats on mass incarceration. I've heard the saying that, well, blacks are arrested more because they commit more crimes. So statistically, the United States is made up of 13.4% of Black people. Our prisons are made up of 34% of Black people. 1 in 3 Blacks will go to jail statistically in our country, which is 33% versus about 4% to their white counterparts. And their white counterparts have a 25% chance of those charges being dropped. So just a couple of quick stories that I want to point out. Recently, we saw a white teenager take an assault rifle, cross state lines, and kill a protester at a rally. Some of our political leaders are calling him a hero. On the other end, there is 16-year-old Centonio Brown. She was being violently raped and she killed her rapist. She got life in prison at 16. Right? We had Brock Turner, which was a swimmer from Stanford, and he violently raped somebody, and he was given 6 months, where the maximum sentence should have been 14 years. He only served 3 months of those, and the judge said, well, I don't want to ruin his future. But in New York, we had Khalif Broder, who was 16 years old. He was accused of stealing a book bag. He spent 3 years in Rikers, 2 years in solitary confinement, and never had a trial. This is systemic racism.
Absolutely.
And
Those statistics and facts that you bring are really just overwhelming.
and that,
Gary?
just to piggyback off of that, I agree, and that is where these broader discussions have to take place, and we have to understand why laws were enacted and the way in which those laws were enforced. Whether they be drug laws or other rules and regulations. Why were they developed and how were they enforced? The state of Connecticut early on recognized that they wanted to get an understanding of why are we doing racial profiling in law enforcement? Are more African American individuals or minorities being pulled over by police than others? And then what happens when they are stopped, which is significant. We could stop a lot of people, but if I'm only searching vehicles of young Black men, then there's a problem with me as a police officer. So I think this touches to a lot of it because it goes towards the fact of never addressing the problem so that there is a future for these individuals who may have made 1 or 2 mistakes. And I think that's crucial to all these conversations moving forward. And law enforcement is the gateway to that, to the criminal justice system. So that's a good place to start, and we all need to remember that.
Thank you, Gary. Bill Usman, are you still here with us? Bill, I know that you teach about this, that you talk about this. I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about this whole idea of police brutality and mass incarceration.
Well, I think first we have to disavow the myth that critiquing criminal justice in this way is attacking individual police officers or judges or prosecutors. Gary McNamara, who's here with us tonight, he's a great example that there are many people who work in criminal justice who fully admit that the U.S. system of policing and incarceration has historically been grounded in white supremacy and continues to be so even as we sit here talking tonight. So calling for an end to police brutality and calling for changes in how we incarcerate people is not an attack on the police, as some would like us to believe. We can't ignore the statistics. We can't ignore the individual tragic stories like the ones that Daniel so well pointed out. It's a hard truth that we have to be willing to acknowledge. The United States of America locks up more of its own citizens than any other democratic nation on the planet. And it disproportionately locks up Black and brown people. And as Daniel pointed out, not because they commit more crimes. That's not the reason for this. At every stage in the criminal justice system, we see racial discrimination. Black people are more likely to be arrested. They're more likely to be sentenced to jail. They're more likely to be given a harsher, longer system. And this is when the charge is exactly the same as that which has been assigned to a white person. So the only difference there is race. Marijuana possession is a perfect example of this, that, actually white youth use marijuana at a higher rate than Black youth, but they are much, much less likely to be imprisoned for it. So this is something that we have to face up to. And I think the first step is admitting these truths and stop blaming the victims of a white supremacist criminal injustice system.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much. And, I want to really turn to Daniel and then Aisha and Julie, because listening to all of this, the taboo about talking about race, the structural and systemic embeddedness of racism in our country, the rationalization from the time of slavery to now of racism, and now these more recent topics of police brutality, and we've brought up some really challenging topics. Daniel, I want to start with you. How do we talk about these topics with our students, our employees, our coworkers, our neighbors? How do we do that?
Yeah, so when it comes to talking about racism or the topics of race with your friends, the first thing I just want to say to everyone is life is short. Don't die resenting a good friend, a family member. And remember what the purpose of the conversation is. It's to remove hurdles that someone of color may be having in their everyday life. So I always say create a grace space where you and vow to each other that no matter what we say today, we're going to be friends at the end of it. So don't unfriend me, don't block me. Most people really want to learn. So make sure there's a grace space there. If you're Black, maybe it's something where you talk to your friends about an experience you've had and tell them how it is you feel. If you're white, you don't want to push the conversation because you never know what happened in a Black person's life where they may not want to talk about it. So maybe do a little bit of research on your own. But again, never forgetting the purpose of what the conversation is and why you're having it. It's not to set us back. It's to make sure that those hurdles that may be in the way now are removed.
Thank you, Daniel. Aisha.
Yes, and one point I want to make that we were just to kind of tap off the police brutality is, police were founded as slave patrols, right? That's if you look at the sheriff star and the slave patrol star, it's the same. So for us to kind of again to combat the systemic change within our police departments, we really have to acknowledge why they were even formed to begin with. And so when you're talking to your friends and, this is what I do for work. So when you're talking to your students, I reread, So You Want to Talk About Race in preparation for this evening. And it's a great, opinion, and she shares a lot of great stories and gives students a great opportunity to hear from another person. But it's really just diversifying your circle. Daniel talks about, not blocking and defriending folks, some of which deserve it. So if you have to, by all means, I'm going to co-sign that, because you can't have that negativity in your life sometimes. But people aren't always willing to listen. But when you find the people who are, please engage with them. Please have, really open and frank conversations with them to be able to learn more about you and your experience. I have a different lived Black experience than Daniel, and he has for me and anyone else. So it's hard to really pull it all together to say, this is how it is to be Black. I can give you Aisha's point of view of how to be Black, and I will. And that's what I do in my role. And that's how I, explain my life to my friends when, in high school, they'd be like, oh, Aisha, you sound like a white girl. Like, I don't sound like a white girl. I sound like Aisha, right? And you have to break down and let them know why what they've said was offensive, let them understand. And also, to Daniel's point, that's not something I'm always going to be willing to do. You're also going to have to, friends and family, take some time on your, journey of evolution to learn more and to dive deeper into the conversation, and then be able to feel like you can come into it. And another thing that I've heard throughout the past few months, of people are scared. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to, offend anybody. That's part of life. My husband's a Giants fan. We live in Massachusetts. Go Pats. That's going to offend someone, but you have to have a conversation about it, right? It's not something that you're going to always be right about. You really have to be open and honest and be willing to listen and say something wrong. And when someone acknowledges that you've done something wrong, hearing that and pivoting and moving forward in a new way. So I think that's the best way to really have conversations, is acknowledging that you don't know everything. The person you're speaking to doesn't know everything, and that you're both just willing to be, partners along this journey to make society and, overcome, Rachel, systemic problems as we work together. So I guess that, that would be my
Thank you.
advice to folks looking to
And
discuss.
you've given us a lot. You've given us a lot. I know that we're running short on time, but Julie, how would you respond to that in just a minute or two?
Absolutely. I definitely agree with what Daniel and Aisha shared. I like to say that these conversations are messy and we have to stay with the discomfort. People that play sports know, particularly football, if all those players are over there in a huddle fighting and stuff, you can assume that the ball is there. So we must go toward the pressure. We have to move toward the pressure, practice the bravery, and be ready to mess up. And then the recipient has to give the grace space to correct, to support learning. And it's okay to not agree. It's not okay to shut down each other, to lose friendships over these differences. Ideally, we have people in our lives. And I also like what Aisha said, we need to diversify our circle. I've done that really well through a lot of sports that I play, golf and skiing. There are a lot of Black people that do both, but a lot of the white people that are my friends and I met through those two sports. And all through my life, being from Fairfield, being a Sacred Heart alum, I've always lived in a world where there are Black people and there are white people and there are people from other countries. So that would be my advice, is to really stick with the discomfort, maintain your friendships, agree to disagree, but agree to come back to it and to continue to learn from each other. And Thanksgiving will be the perfect time to practice.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you. So, Aisha and Daniel, I want to ask you too, as alums of Sacred Heart, you're both very successful, and yet I'm sure that you've faced challenges, and we're a little short on time. But in a sentence, what would you advise students of color at Sacred Heart and our white students? What advice would you give them?
As far as
Well, based on all of the
on
things that we talked
everything
about
we've talked
tonight,
about. Yeah, and again,
just in a sentence.
continue being who you are, continue learning, continue going out there and making and understanding our history so that we can build a better future.
Thank you. And Aisha, I want to
Yeah, I
ask you.
agree. Sure, Daniel, I agree with what you said. And, to all the students not just the students of color, but all students at Sacred Heart University. You have a unique experience to come together and learn from each other on this campus. So I recommend that you do that and take the time to go into the Multicultural Center to expand your horizons and really have open and honest conversations with your fellow pioneers.
Thank you, Aisha. Julie, I know Sacred Heart has been doing quite a lot. We don't have enough time to say all of the things, but can you tell us the top 3 things that the university's been doing to address this whole topic of race and racism and to provide racial justice?
Mhm. Yeah, I'll touch on what Aisha said. We have a brand new multicultural center. It opened in September, and we are looking for allies as well as students from underrepresented and marginalized groups to come together and learn from each other, like we just discussed. We also are working with academic affairs to help our faculty to build more multiculturally appropriate content so that students are learning about different cultures and learning how to navigate those cultures as they become graduates and enter the workforce. Also, we are going to be having some training coming up on implicit bias to set a baseline for not only our employees but our students as well, and that will be coming next semester. Aisha mentioned that we had our incoming freshmen read So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, which also sparked a lot of conversation. Students wrote papers. I read some of them. They were quite good, and ideally really are helping at least our freshman incoming class to begin to start to open up their minds to bring in different perspectives. Not to say that they aren't open, but to open them even more, which is the point of being at Sacred Heart
And that's,
University.
thank you, Julie. And of course, that is the whole point of education, right? To lead ourselves out of those darkness, right? Our prejudices, our biases to enlightenment and to understanding. And I want to add that our Heart Challenges Hate series is another opportunity from sponsored at Sacred Heart to help our larger audience talk about these really challenging topics. I want to thank Daniel and Julie and Gary and Aisha and Bill. Thank you all so much for all that you contributed and brought to this conversation. And I know we've just really touched the tip of the iceberg. We're going to have more of these conversations, go into it even more deeply. But I'm really grateful to all of you and to our audience. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We'll see you at another Heart Challenges Hate colloquia. Good night.
Thank you for joining tonight's conversation. To learn more, visit sacredheart.edu.